The train had been running 12 hours late by the time it pulled into Coldwater Pass, and by then it didn't matter much because Evelyn Hart had already stopped expecting things to go her way. She sat in the last passenger car with her suitcase wedged between her knees and her coat buttoned to the throat despite the fact that the coal stove in the corner had been dead since Cheyenne. Around her, the other passengers had long since run out of conversation. A cattle rancher in the seat across the aisle snored with his hat over his face. Two women in traveling clothes murmured to each other and glanced at Evelyn once, then away. The way people do when they've decided something about a person and don't want to be caught at it. She didn't blame them. She'd been sitting alone since she boarded in Chicago, and there was something about a woman traveling alone in December of 1885 that made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite name. It wasn't improper exactly. It wasn't anything they could point to. It was simply that a woman without an escort, without a visible reason, without a visible destination, suggested a story nobody wanted to know the ending of. Evelyn knew the ending. That was the problem. Outside the window, Wyoming stretched away in every direction, white and indifferent, the kind of landscape that made a person feel very small and very temporary. The mountains in the distance were enormous and dark against the pale sky, their peaks caught in cloud. She had never seen mountains before. In Ohio, where she'd grown up, the land was flat and worked and familiar. In Chicago, where she'd spent the last 4 years, everything was vertical and close together, all brick and soot and the smell of the river. These mountains were something else entirely. They looked like they'd been there since before anything else and would still be there after everything else was gone. The train slowed with the long mechanical groan, and the conductor came through calling out Coldwater Pass in a voice that suggested he found the name as bleak as she did. She gathered her suitcase and her coat and stepped off onto a platform that was nothing more than 2 planks of frosted wood over frozen mud. The air hit her like a door slammed in her face, sharp and thin and smelling of pine and cold stone and something else, something she couldn't name, that was simply the smell of a place very far from anything comfortable. Coldwater Pass was not a large town. It had a main street with a general store, a bank, a hotel of questionable quality, a barber shop, 2 saloons, a church with a crooked steeple, and a scattering of houses behind them all like an afterthought. At the end of the street, the mountains started. There was no gradual transition. The town simply ended and the wilderness began, as abrupt as a sentence cut off mid-thought. She had 37 cents, and the address of a man named Harold Pruitt, written in her dead husband's handwriting on a piece of paper she'd folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft. The bank was easy enough to find. It was the only building on the street with glass windows on both sides of the door. The man behind the desk when she walked in was maybe 50, with the particular look of a banker in a small town. Pressed, careful, slightly smug, in the way that comes from being one of the few people in a place who doesn't have to worry about money. He looked up when she came in, and his expression shifted through several stages before settling on something that was almost sympathy. "Mrs. Hart," he said, which told her he'd been expecting her. "Mr. Pruitt." She set her suitcase down because her arm was tired and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "I've come about my husband's accounts." "Yes." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit." She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She had gotten very good, in the past 8 months, at sitting in chairs across from men who were about to tell her things she didn't want to hear. "I'll be plain with you," Pruitt said, which was what people said when they intended to be unkind in an efficient manner. "Your husband's estate is, as I wrote to you in September, essentially liquidated. The debts were substantial. What remained after his creditors were settled was—" He paused. "Minimal." "How minimal?" He told her. She had known the number from the letter, but hearing it said aloud in this cold little office made it real in a different way. She breathed through it carefully, the way she'd learned to breathe through things. "The property in Chicago," she said. "Sold. The creditors moved quickly after his passing. I'm sorry." "The accounts he maintained here?" Pruitt shifted in his chair. "There were no active accounts, Mrs. Hart. Your husband had borrowed against his holdings here as well. The note came due in August. I'm afraid the bank is holding a lien." "On what?" "The parcel of land he purchased east of town. 20 acres. There was a structure on it quite modest, which was included in the lien." He paused again. "I did write to you about all of this." "You wrote," she agreed. I came anyway. She looked at her hands. What are my options? Pruitt was quiet for a moment in the way of a man organizing words he'd been preparing but still didn't enjoy delivering. You could contest the lien, of course. That would require legal representation and an extended stay in Coldwater Pass, and I'll be honest with you, the outcome would be uncertain at best. Or you could accept the bank's position, in which case the lien stands and the parcel passes to us formally. Your husband's remaining personal effects, such as they were, have been stored at the hotel. He paused. There was also a third possibility that came to my attention just this week. Voss. She looked up. I don't know that it's... He seemed to be choosing words. There's a man in the area, lives up in the mountains. He's been working this county for 20 years, mostly alone, mostly keeps to himself. He came into town 3 days ago and, well, he heard you were coming, somehow. People talk. He glanced at the window. He came into the bank and asked me to convey an offer. What kind of offer? Pruitt cleared his throat. Marriage. The words sat in the air between them for a long moment. A man I've never met, Evelyn said slowly, who lives in the mountains, sent you to tell me he'd like to marry me. That's the shape of it, yes. Who is he? His name is Silas Boon. Pruitt paused in a way that suggested the name carried weight. He's been in this county longer than most. I'll say this, he's not a man anyone knows well. He keeps to himself, as I said, the townspeople. Another pause. People have opinions. What kind of opinions? Pruitt looked at the window. He doesn't conform to what most people around here would call normal behavior. He doesn't socialize. He's rough in his manner, not what you'd call polished. There are stories. He seemed to decide against elaborating. I want you to understand I'm simply conveying his offer. What you do with it is entirely your own matter. She thought about 37 cents. She thought about a hotel room she could afford for perhaps 2 nights. She thought about the train east and what waited at the other end of it. Nothing, or the particular kind of nothing that has people in it who feel sorry for you, which was worse. Where is he now? She said. Well, he was at the saloon, not drinking. That was the first thing that struck her. He was sitting at a corner table with a glass of water in front of him, and everything else in the room seemed to be organizing itself around where he was in the way that things organize themselves around something large and quiet, like a rock in a stream. He was bigger than she'd expected. Not tall in a dramatic way, but wide through the shoulders, built like someone who spent his life moving heavy things, with hands that rested flat on the table and looked like they could have been carved from the same material as the mountains outside. His coat was worn leather, cracked at the seams, mended with what appeared to be actual leather cord in at least 3 places. His face was weathered to a deep brown, scarred at the jaw on the left side in a way that suggested something long ago that had not healed cleanly. His hair was dark and going gray at the temples and badly cut, like he'd done it himself with a knife. He was not a handsome man. He was not an ugly one either. He was a face that had been lived in extremely hard. When she walked across the room and stopped at his table, every other person in the saloon went quiet in the way of people who have identified something interesting and don't want to miss any of it. He looked at her. His eyes were gray, darker than she'd expected, and utterly without performance. He was not trying to seem anything. He was just looking at her, steady and still, like he had all the time in the world and wasn't particularly attached to any outcome. Mr. Boon, she said. Mrs. Hart. His voice was low, not what she'd expected either. Not rough or loud, but quiet. The voice of a man who had learned that the world leans in to hear people who don't shout. Sit down if you want. She sat down. You know why I'm here, she said. I do. Then you know I'm in a situation that doesn't leave me a lot of choices. I know that. So I want to be plain with you, she said, using the same phrase Pruitt had used, but meaning something different by it. I don't know you. I don't know anything about you except that you live in the mountains and you sent a banker to propose marriage on your behalf, which is not a normal thing to do. And I'm not here because I think this is a good idea. I'm here because I'm trying to understand what the offer actually is before I decide whether it's better or worse than the alternative. He considered that for a moment. That's fair. So tell me, what is the offer? He turned the glass of water on the table, once, like he was thinking about where to start. I've got a place up in the mountains, good shelter, enough food, Wood. Water that doesn't freeze until January most years. It's not easy living, but it's decent living. He looked at her. I'm not looking for a servant or someone to manage a house. I'm looking for... He paused for what seemed like genuine thought. Company. Someone to talk to. Someone who might want to learn what I know about this land. I've been up there alone a long time. Why me? She said. You don't know me either. No, he agreed. But Pruitt told me why you'd come, and I figured a woman who'd travel alone to Wyoming in December to try to fix something unfixable, she's got more spine than most men I've known. He glanced down at the glass. Could be wrong. You could be wrong about a lot of things. Yes, he said, without any indication that this bothered him. She looked at him for a long moment. Across the room, she was aware of the two men at the bar pretending to look at their drinks, and the woman behind the bar not pretending at all. People here think you're, she chose the word carefully. Strange. I know what people here think. And they're entitled to their opinion. He met her eyes. I'm not asking you to care what they think. I'm not asking you to care what I think, for that matter. I'm asking if you want a place to be that's better than the alternative. The alternative, she thought. The train east. The furnished room in someone's house in Cleveland, taking in mending, slowly spending down the last of her dignity along with the last of her money. Her sister's front parlor and her sister's husband's expression every time she sat down to dinner. The cold, specific misery of being dependent on people who were kind to you in ways that reminded you constantly of your dependence. One more question, she said. He waited. What happened to your face? It was not a polite question. She watched him decide whether to be offended by it. Watched him decide he wasn't. He touched the scar at his jaw briefly, not self-consciously, but the way a person touches an old thing they've made peace with. Rock face, he said. Climbing accident, long time ago. She nodded. Then she stood up, picked up her suitcase, and said, When do we leave? They were married the next morning by the town's justice of the peace, a man named Colburn, who had small wet eyes and kept looking at Evelyn like he was waiting for her to change her mind. She didn't change her mind. She signed the paper, Silas signed the paper, and that was that. No ceremony, no gathering of witnesses, just two people in a cold office with frost on the window making a legal agreement and calling it marriage. The town did not take it quietly. She heard it starting before they'd even left the courthouse. The particular sound of a small community activating its opinion machinery. At the general store, where Silas bought provisions for the journey up the mountain, the man behind the counter served him with the exaggerated neutrality of someone working very hard not to say what he was thinking. Two women outside on the wooden sidewalk watched Evelyn with a mixture of pity and fascination that she recognized from Chicago, from the months after Thomas died, from every moment when she had been the subject of someone else's concern that was really just curiosity in a more flattering coat. Doesn't bother you, she said to Silas as they loaded the horse. He glanced at her. What doesn't? All of it. She gestured vaguely at the town. They're talking about us. They were talking about me before you got here, he said, and they'll keep talking after we leave. Nothing changes about that. He tightened a strap on the pack. You can let it bother you, or you can't. Your choice. Easy to say when you're used to it. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her with those gray eyes that were difficult to read. You think I don't know that? He went back to the strap. First few years it bothered me plenty. I'd get angry. Then I'd feel stupid for being angry. Took a while to understand that what they think about me has nothing to do with what I actually am. He paused. That doesn't mean it stops hurting. It just means you stop giving it power it doesn't deserve. She stood there for a moment with that, then picked up the second pack and held it out for him to secure. They left Coldwater Pass in the early afternoon, with 3 days of supplies and one pack horse, and the sky the color of old pewter above the mountains. She had her suitcase secured to the animal's back alongside the provisions. She wore her warmest coat and boots that were entirely wrong for mountain terrain, and a pair of wool gloves she'd bought at the general store with 25 of her 37 cents. The remaining 12 cents she kept in her coat pocket because it seemed important to hold on to something. The trail out of Coldwater Pass climbed immediately. There was no gentle approach, no gradual elevation, no slow introduction to the idea of mountains. The land simply tilted upward within half a mile of town and kept tilting, the pines closing in on both sides as the path narrowed, the cold sharpening as they gained altitude in a way that was different from the flat cold of the town. This was a cold that came from multiple directions, from the snow underfoot and the wind off the slopes and the shadow of the trees, and it settled into her bones in a manner that was almost instructive, like the mountain was explaining itself. Silas walked ahead, leading the pack horse, and he moved through the terrain with a kind of attention she hadn't seen before. Not careful, exactly, not cautious, but present in a way most people weren't present. He was constantly reading something. She watched him glance at the sky, at the snow along the trail, at the way the trees bent or didn't bend, at marks on the ground she couldn't interpret. It was like watching someone read a book in a language she didn't know. "What are you looking at?" she said, after about an hour of this. He glanced back at her. "Tracking sign. Storm came through here 3 days ago. Elk herd, 30 or 40 strong, moved down the south slope." He pointed at a line of disturbed snow along the edge of the tree line. "That tells me the upper elevations have more snow than usual for this time of year. Is that a problem? Might mean the pass is tighter than I'd like." He kept walking. "We'll see when we get there." "How long to get there?" 2 days if the weather holds. 3 if it doesn't." She looked at the sky. The pewter was darkening at the edges. "And if it doesn't hold?" "Then we find shelter and wait." He said it like it was completely simple and obvious, which she supposed to him it was. "You ever spent a night in the open before?" "No." "You'll be fine." He glanced back again. "You're tougher than you think." "You don't know anything about how tough I am." "No," he agreed. "But you came to Wyoming alone in December. That tells me something." She didn't answer that. She was breathing harder than she wanted to admit because the altitude was already doing something to the air, making it thinner, making her lungs work in a way they hadn't before. She concentrated on placing her feet carefully, on keeping the rhythm of the walk, on not thinking about how far they'd come or how far they had to go. They made camp that first night in a hollow of rock that Silas seemed to know from memory, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides. He built a fire quickly and efficiently, without apparent effort, the way people do things they've done 10,000 times. He made something from the provisions, dried meat and hardtack and what appeared to be some kind of dried root that she didn't ask about, and handed her a tin cup of coffee that tasted rough and good. She sat across the fire from him with her knees drawn up and her back against the stone, and for a moment she let herself simply be where she was, not thinking forward or backward, just existing in the firelight and the cold and the impossible silence of the mountain night, which was unlike any silence she had known. It was not the absence of sound so much as the presence of a kind of stillness that had depth to it, that went down and down. "Tell me about Thomas," Silas said. She looked up, surprised. "Your husband," he said. "You don't have to. But we're going to be up here a while, and I'd rather know who you actually are than make guesses." She considered that. Then she said, "He was a businessman. Import trade, mostly textiles. We were married 6 years. He was not unkind. He was a person who knew what he wanted and organized his life to get it, and for a while I was part of what he wanted." She turned the tin cup in her hands. "He got sick in the spring. It was fast. He was dead by July." "Did you love him?" The question was blunt but not cruel. He asked it the way he asked everything, like he was genuinely interested in the answer and wasn't going to perform any particular response to whatever she said. "I respected him," she said finally. "I think that's different. I was 22 when we married. I didn't know enough to know what love was supposed to feel like. I knew he was steady and capable, and that being married to him meant I didn't have to be afraid about the practical things." She paused. "When he died, I was more scared about being alone than I was sad about losing him, and I've had to sit with what that means about me for the past 8 months. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Sounds honest, at least." "It's not flattering. Most honest things aren't." He looked at the fire. "I was engaged once, long time ago. She died." "I'm sorry." "Me too." He said it simply, without performance. "That was 15 years back now. You'd think it would stop feeling like something, and then sometimes it just doesn't." "What was she like?" He was quiet for a long time, just long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Smart," he said. "Impatient. She had opinions about everything, and she'd tell you about them whether you wanted to know or not." He almost smiled, or something around his eyes shifted that might have been the beginning of a smile. She would have found this situation, you and me up here, she would have found it very funny. Would she have approved? He looked up from the fire. Of you? I don't know you yet. He met her eyes. Ask me in a year. The second day was harder. The trail became less a trail and more a suggestion. A series of rocks and roots and packed snow that Silas navigated with the same unhurried certainty, but that required every bit of Evelyn's concentration just to keep her feet. The pack horse was steadier than she was on the terrain, which she found both reassuring and slightly humiliating. The cold was different at this altitude. It was not just temperature, but pressure, something that pushed against the exposed skin of her face and the back of her neck and made her eyes water. She was breathing hard all the time now, not from exertion alone, but from the thinness of the air, and twice she had to stop and put her hands on her knees and wait for the dizziness to pass. Altitude, Silas said the second time. He handed her a piece of dried meat. Eat. It helps. And go slower. We don't have time to go slower. We have more time than you think. The storm I was watching yesterday, it moved north. We've probably got another day before anything comes in. He studied her for a moment. You're not used to this. Don't try to keep pace with me. Set your own pace and I'll adjust. She ate the dried meat, which tasted of salt and something smoky, and stood back up. I'm not going to be a burden to you. Didn't say you were. But you're thinking it. He looked at her with something in his expression that wasn't quite exasperation, but was in the neighborhood of it. I'm thinking you're managing a significant altitude change for the first time in your life while wearing boots that were made for city sidewalks, he said. I'm thinking if I were in Chicago for the first time trying to navigate the business district, you'd probably have to slow down for me. Neither of those things makes either of us a burden. They make us people in unfamiliar places. He picked up the rope to the pack horse. Come on when you're ready. She stood there for a moment after he'd started walking again, holding the tin cup and the piece of dried meat and feeling something that was not quite gratitude and not quite irritation, but some combination of both. A feeling of being seen accurately by someone who wasn't being kind about it, but wasn't being unkind either. Just direct. Just honest about what was in front of them. It was, she realized, the first time in months that someone had talked to her like she was a competent person temporarily in difficult circumstances, rather than a woman to be managed or pitied. Thomas's creditors had talked to her like she was a problem. Pruitt had talked to her like she was a delicate situation. Her sister, in the one telephone call she'd managed to place before leaving Chicago, had talked to her like she was a small child who had made a series of inexplicable choices. Silas talked to her like she was someone who could handle the truth. It was unfamiliar enough to be slightly disorienting. She followed him. They were approaching the upper slopes, where the tree line thinned and the rock faces began to dominate, when the storm found them after all. Not the gradual kind of mountain storm she might have imagined, with a darkening sky and building wind and time to prepare. This one simply arrived. 1 minute the sky was gray and quiet. The next minute the wind hit them hard from the northwest, and the snow came horizontal, thick and fast, the kind that reduces visibility to arm's length inside of 60 seconds. There, Silas said, not shouting though the wind was loud, saying it right next to her ear, his hand on her shoulder turning her. Rock face 20 feet. Move. She moved. She couldn't see 20 feet in any direction, but she trusted the directional certainty in his hand, and she pushed through the snow with her head down and her arm up against the wind, and in what felt like much longer than 20 feet, she ran her hand into solid rock. Silas was already there, working the pack horse into a narrow cut in the cliff face she wouldn't have seen in good visibility, let alone this. She squeezed in after the animal, and the wind cut off immediately, replaced by a cold that was still severe but no longer moving, no longer trying to peel her skin off. How did you know this was here? She said. She was breathing hard. I've been on this mountain a few hundred times. He secured the horse to an outcrop and checked the animal's legs quickly, efficiently. There are maybe 30 places along this route where you can shelter. You learn them. What if we hadn't been near one? We were always going to be near one. I timed the route so we'd have shelter options at every point. That's part of knowing the mountain. He glanced at her. You all right? Yes. She was. She was cold and shaken, and her heart was still running fast, but she was all right. She looked around the shelter, a natural cut in the granite, maybe 8 feet deep and 4 feet wide, just enough for 2 people and a horse if you didn't mind being close. Is the storm going to get worse? Probably. It'll blow itself out by morning. He was pulling supplies from the packs on the horse, moving with the calm efficiency of a man doing something he'd done before. We'll camp here tonight. Tomorrow's the last hard section, and then we'll be through the pass and into the valley. What's on the other side of the pass? He looked up from what he was doing. Home, he said. She heard something in that single word that she wasn't entirely sure how to interpret. Not sentimentality, not pride exactly, but something close to both of those things, or something beneath them, something more fundamental. She filed it away. The night in the rock shelter was close and cold, and smelled of horse and pine smoke from the tiny fire Silas built at the mouth of the cut, feeding it small pieces of wood from the pack in amounts that she slowly understood were calculated. Enough heat to keep them functional, not so much that it burned through the supply faster than necessary. He didn't explain his calculations. He just made them, quiet and certain, and the fire stayed the same size all night. They slept in shifts. She insisted on taking a turn keeping the fire, and he looked at her for a moment and then agreed, which she appreciated. She sat up through the middle hours of the night, feeding small pieces of wood to the fire, listening to the storm howl and batter at the rock above them, watching Silas sleep with his back to the cliff face and his coat pulled up and his face still and younger than she'd thought when he was awake. She was very far from everything she'd known. That thought sat in her chest for a while, not with the weight of grief exactly, but with the strange lightness of something completely cut loose. Chicago and Thomas and the creditors and the parlors and the women who looked at her with that particular complicated pity, all of it 2 days behind her and the mountain between them. She didn't know what was on the other side of the pass. She didn't know what she was building toward. She didn't know anything about the man sleeping 4 feet from her, except that he could read storms and find shelter in a blizzard and talk to her like she was a real person. But for the first time in 8 months, she wasn't afraid. Not because things were good. Things were arguably more precarious than they'd been in the bank office in Coldwater Pass, but precarious in the way of something genuinely unknown, something still open, rather than precarious in the way of a path closing off behind her with no other path visible. She thought about what he'd said about the women who looked at her, that what people think about you has nothing to do with what you actually are. She turned that over for a while. Then she put another piece of wood on the fire and watched the sparks lift into the dark air of the cut and disappear. Tuck. The storm was gone by first light, exactly as he'd said. The world on the other side of the rock cut was white and still, and so bright it was almost painful. The snow unmarked except for the track of a single animal that had passed in the night. She would learn later that it was a mountain cat, making its rounds along the cliff face. They broke camp quickly and moved. The last section of trail was steep and punishing in the aftermath of the storm, the snow deep enough in places that she was lifting her legs high with every step, and the pack horse labored and she put her shoulder to the animal's flank twice to help it through the worst of it. Her boots were soaked through and her toes were something between very cold and not quite there, and she focused on that rather than on the height or the exposure of the upper slopes. The way the trail opened up along a cliff edge that dropped away to nothing on the left side. Silas was ahead, and he turned back once to check on her, and she made a gesture with her hand that she hoped communicated something like, "Fine, keep going," and he did. The pass was a gap in the ridge, narrow and wind-scoured, the granite walls on both sides close enough to touch. She went through it behind Silas and the pack horse, and stood for a moment in the gap between the walls and looked back at where she'd come from. The slope they'd climbed, the valley of Coldwater Pass somewhere far below, invisible in the distance. Then she turned around and looked at what was in front of her. The valley below the pass was impossible. That was her first thought. Impossible. The slopes on the other side of the ridge fell away into something that should not, by any rule of December in Wyoming, have been what it was. A broad, protected valley, perhaps 2 miles across, shaped like a cupped hand, the walls of the surrounding mountains cutting the wind on every side. There was snow, but less snow than on the heights. And within the valley's protection, the trees were a deep and living green, not the frost-killed stillness of the upper slopes. There was water visible, a creek running open and dark through the valley floor, not frozen. There was grass, brown and dormant but present, along the creek banks, and at the center of it, barely visible from this height, a structure. Stone, she thought, More than one structure, perhaps. Something that had clearly been built with considerable care. She stood in the pass and stared at it. "Come on," Silas said from ahead, not looking back now. "Careful on the descent. This side is icy." She followed him down. The descent took 2 hours, careful and slow, and as they got lower, the temperature shifted in ways she could feel on her face. Still cold, but a different cold. A cold with less edge. A cold that felt like it was being held in check by something. By the time they reached the valley floor, she could hear the creak and feel actual moisture in the air rather than the desiccated sharpness of the heights. She was looking at the structure as they approached. Stone walls, properly mortared, not the rough dry stacking she'd seen on frontier buildings. Windows, real windows, with glass catching the afternoon light. A roof of split timber, steeply pitched for snow load. A second smaller building attached at the back, and a third building 100 feet away that might have been a stable. It was not a cabin. It was not a frontier homestead. It was something built by someone who knew how to build, who had both the skill and the intention to build well. She stopped. Silas stopped too and waited, because he could see she'd stopped. "You built this," she said. "Yes." "All of it." "Yes." She looked at him. Then she looked back at the building. "By yourself." Mostly. He seemed to be watching her carefully in that way of his, reading her the way he read the terrain and the sky. "Took about 12 years to get it where it is." 12 years. "I didn't rush." She let out a breath that came out as a faint laugh, though she hadn't intended it as one. "No," she said. "I suppose you didn't." She stood in the valley that shouldn't have been there, with the mountains closing around it on all sides like walls, and looked at the stone and glass building that a man the town of Coldwater Pass considered worthless had spent 12 years building alone in a wilderness that most people would never see in their lives. She thought about what she'd said to him in the saloon, about not having choices, about this being better or worse than the alternative. She didn't know yet what kind of man he was underneath the competence and the quiet. She didn't know what 12 years of solitude had done to a person or what loss had done to him before that. She didn't know how they were going to share this space or this life or this strange arrangement they'd signed their names to in a cold office 2 days ago. But she stood in the hidden valley with the creek running beside her and the stone house waiting at the center of it, and something in her chest that had been braced for 8 months. That tight, protective brace she'd been holding since July. Since the moment the doctor came out of the bedroom with that look on his face. Something in her chest eased a degree. Not much. Not enough to call relief or hope or anything that comfortable. Just a degree. Just enough to notice. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the house. The inside of the house was warmer than it had any right to be. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed when she stepped through the door. Not the layout, not the furnishings, not the size of the rooms, but the warmth, which was immediate and serious, and came from a stone fireplace on the far wall that was built so precisely into the corner that it seemed like the house had grown around it rather than the other way around. The stones were fitted without gaps, mortared smooth, and the chimney drew perfectly. She could see the fire pulling clean, no smoke backing into the room. Someone had understood fire and stone and the relationship between them in a way that went beyond basic construction. She stood in the doorway and looked. The main room was larger than she'd expected from the outside. A long work table dominated one wall, covered in drawings. Rolled papers and flat sheets, weighted at the corners with stones and tools, covered in lines and measurements she couldn't read from this distance. Shelves above it held books, actual books, more than she'd imagined finding in a mountain wilderness, arranged without obvious system but clearly used. A rough wooden chair sat beside the fireplace with a blanket folded over the back. The floor was stone, fitted and level. The windows she'd seen from the slope were real glass, set in wooden frames that fit their openings tightly, and the afternoon light came through them at angles that made the room feel less like a frontier shelter and more like something deliberate, something considered. It was not a comfortable room in any conventional sense. It had no softness to it, no decoration, nothing that had been chosen for beauty. But it had a quality she would spend the next several days trying to name before she found the right word for it, which was integrity. Everything in it was honest about what it was. Nothing was pretending to be something else. Silas came in behind her with the packs and set them on the floor without ceremony. "Back room's the bedroom," he said. Take it. I'll sleep out here. She turned to look at him. That's your room. I don't care much about rooms. He moved to the fire and fed it 2 large pieces of wood from the stack beside the hearth. Get your boots off and get warm. Your feet have been wet for 3 hours. She didn't argue because he was right about her feet, which were making themselves known in an unpleasant way as the warmth of the room started to reach them. She sat in the chair beside the fire and unlaced the boots. City boots, as he'd said, made for walking on stone sidewalks, already ruined, and peeled off the wool socks, which were wet through and had rubbed blisters on both heels she hadn't been aware of during the descent, because everything else had been more urgent. I need to dry these, she said, holding up the socks. He took them from her without comment and hung them on a line she hadn't noticed that ran along the wall near the fire. Then he disappeared into the back room and came back with a pair of wool socks that were enormous on her but dry, and a blanket. Thank you, she said. We'll get you proper boots when the weather opens up, he said. I've got materials. I can make something that'll fit. She looked at him. You make boots. I make most things. He said it without pride, simply as a statement of fact. Had to learn. There's no general store 2 days up a mountain. She watched him move around the room, putting things away, checking the fire, the particular efficient movement of a man who knew exactly where everything was and why. She thought about the building she'd seen from the pass. Stone walls, fitted glass, a timber roof built to shed weight. 12 years, alone. The drawings on that table, she said. He glanced at the work table. Are those buildings? A pause. Not a long one. Yes. Buildings you've built here, or some here, some... He stopped. Some from before. The before was a wall she could hear in his voice, not hostile but definite. She noted it and moved past it for now. Can I look at them? Another pause. Go ahead. She crossed the room in the enormous wool socks and stood before the work table. The drawings were detailed in a way that surprised her. Not rough sketches, but technical work, precise lines and measured annotations, the kind of drawings that required specific training to produce. She didn't know how to read them technically, but she could see the care in them, the patience, the intention. One drawing showed a floor plan of a structure much larger than the building she was standing in. Another showed an elevation, a facade with high windows and a series of arched openings. A third was covered in measurements and notes in a small, cramped hand. She picked up the corner of one and looked at the title block in the lower right. S. A. Boon, architect, and beneath that a date, 1871, 14 years ago. He would have been, late 20s, maybe. She set the paper down carefully and looked at the mountain of it. All these drawings accumulated over years in a stone house in a hidden valley. And she thought about the town of Coldwater Pass and the way Pruitt had said he's rough in his manner, not what you'd call polished, and the way the men at the bar had looked at Silas with that particular contempt that men reserve for other men they've decided are beneath them. She thought about how wrong that was. Not defensively, not on his behalf, but as a simple fact about the nature of wrong assessments and how people made them and what it cost the person on the receiving end. She went back to the fire and said nothing about the drawings. Not yet. The first week was an education in the fundamentals. Silas was not, as it turned out, a patient teacher in the conventional sense. He did not explain things ahead of time or give context or prepare her for what was coming. He simply did things, and when she was there watching, he would say what he was doing, and when she asked questions, he answered them precisely. And when she made mistakes, he said so without making her feel bad about it, and that was the whole of his teaching method. It worked better than she'd expected. She learned how the water system worked. A series of pipes, crude but functional, running from the creek into a cistern built into the rock beneath the house, fed by the elevation and emptied by gravity so that there was always water at a spigot in the main room without anyone having to carry it. She learned how the food stores were organized in the cellar, a cold room built into the north wall that maintained a near-constant temperature through the winter, packed with preserved meats and dried vegetables, and the grain stores that kept the livestock Silas maintained in the smaller building. She learned that the livestock were 2 goats, a pair of mules, and 4 chickens that had survived the winter somehow through sheer cantankerousness. She learned that he woke before light every morning and had already done 2 hours of work by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge. She learned that he ate methodically and without much apparent enjoyment, like fueling something, and that the one exception was coffee, which he made with a seriousness she found disproportionate and which turned out to be justified because the coffee was remarkable. "Where does it come from?" she asked on the fourth morning. "Bring it up from town in the autumn," he said. "Enough to last the winter. Run out one year in a bad storm season. Only time I've been genuinely miserable up here." She looked at him over her cup. Not the isolation, not the cold, the coffee. The coffee. She laughed. A real laugh, which surprised her and apparently surprised him too, because he looked up from his cup with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something uncertain and almost startled. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked back at his cup. "It's just, haven't heard that in a while." She understood what he meant without having to ask. The sound of a laugh in that room. The sound of another person laughing. She looked down at her coffee. "Well," she said, "we'll have to make sure not to run out." The thing she'd come to think of as his silence was not, she was learning, actually silence. It was more like a very specific economy of words. He said what he meant when he had something to mean, and otherwise he was quiet, and she was starting to understand that the quiet was not absence but presence, that it was full of things she hadn't learned to read yet. He communicated an enormous amount through what he did rather than what he said. The way he checked on the water pipes before a cold snap without mentioning the cold snap coming. The way he left extra wood near the fireplace on mornings she'd come down looking tired without comment. The way he angled his chair slightly toward hers in the evenings when they were both in the main room and the fire was going. She was not used to being read that way. Thomas had been a talker, a businessman's talker, always explaining, always making the case, always filling space with the movement of his own thinking. Silas made space and then let things live in it. It took some adjustment. They were 3 weeks into it before they had their first real argument, which happened because she reorganized the grain stores in the cellar. She had a reason, which was that the system he'd been using made no logical sense. Oldest stock at the back, newest at the front, so the oldest was always the last to be used and ran the risk of spoiling. She moved things around into a better system and felt reasonable and competent about it. He came down to the cellar that evening for something and stood in the doorway looking at what she'd done for a long moment. "I moved the grain," she said. "I can see that. The old system meant the oldest stock was always last to be used. This way, oldest at the front so it rotates properly." "I know what rotation is," he said. She paused at his tone, which was flat in a way she hadn't heard before. "Is there a problem? The location of the stores matters." He moved past her and pointed at where she'd moved one of the sacks. "I know this cellar in the dark. I come down here in the dark sometimes, in the middle of the night if something needs checking. I reach for things by where they are and what they feel like, not by seeing them. You move things without telling me. I reach for flour and get salt, and that's a bad morning." She had not thought about that. "Also," he said, and there was something careful in his voice now, like he was deciding how much to say, "I've been running this system for 12 years and nothing's spoiled. So maybe before you reorganize things, you ask if there's a reason for the way they are." She felt the push of irritation, because he had a point, and she didn't like having a point made at her. And then underneath the irritation, a more honest feeling, which was that she'd made an assumption. She'd walked into his space and rearranged it without asking, and she'd done it because it was efficient, and because efficiency justified itself in her mind, and she'd been wrong to do it without talking to him first. "You're right," she said. He looked at her, apparently not expecting that. "I should have asked. I'm sorry." She paused. "But for what it's worth, the rotation system is better. And if you'll tell me which things you locate by feel, I'll put those back where they were and rotate the rest." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Fair enough." They moved things back together, side by side in the cold of the cellar, and he showed her how he navigated in the dark, a skill she hadn't imagined needing and filed away anyway. Afterward, back upstairs with the fire going, he said, "You're not used to asking. You just solve things." "I suppose I am." She looked at the fire. Thomas didn't want to be consulted about the household. He wanted it run and not explained to him. "I'm not Thomas." "No," she said. "You're not." She looked at him. "I'll ask first. In future. And I'll explain my reasons when I have them. he said. In future. It wasn't a handshake or a formal agreement. It was just two people deciding to try something. But the storm that hit in February was the worst of the winter. She knew it was coming 2 days before it arrived because Silas changed. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have named to an outsider, but something in him shifted, a tightening in his attention, the way he moved through the house, checking things with greater frequency and thoroughness, the way he looked at the sky through the north window with an expression she'd learned to read as calculation. "How bad?" she said on the evening before. "Bad enough." He was sealing the gap under the stable door with a length of rope pressed into a clay mixture he'd made in a bucket. "Wind's going to come from the northeast. That's the direction the valley's most open. We'll keep the animals inside, not the stable, the house. Goats and chickens. Mules in the stable with extra hay. Animals in the house. It's happened before." He looked up. 2 goats and 4 chickens for maybe 3 days. I know it's not ideal." I wasn't complaining. She picked up the other end of the rope and fed it along the bottom of the door while he pressed the clay. I was just picturing it. Something near a smile. "You'll adjust." "I'm good at adjusting," she said. He looked at her and she couldn't tell exactly what was in his expression, but it wasn't nothing. The storm arrived overnight and was immediately serious. She woke to the sound of it. Wind against the stone walls with a force that was not like regular wind, but like something continuous and angry, a pressure rather than a movement. The house held. She lay in the dark and listened to it hold, feeling the solidity of the stone through the mattress beneath her, and thought about the 12 years it had taken to build something capable of standing against this. By morning, the snow was past the lower edge of the windows. Silas had been up since before it started, she suspected. When she came out to the main room, he had the fire going high. The 2 goats in a pen he'd constructed overnight from boards in the corner, and the 4 chickens in a wooden crate near the hearth, and coffee ready. And an expression of careful calm that she was learning was what he looked like when things were serious and he had them managed. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." He poured her coffee. "Gonna be a long 3 days." It was a long 3 days. On the second day, with the storm still pounding the valley and the snow up past the first-floor windows on the north side, she found herself sitting across the work table from him while he worked on one of his drawings. She'd been reading. He had more books than she'd initially cataloged, and they ran to engineering and natural history and one unexpected shelf of American poetry. And she put down the book and watched him work for a while. He had a precision in drawing that she'd noticed before but hadn't seen this closely. The way he held the pencil, the way he measured twice before every line, the way he'd stop and look at what he'd done and then erase a portion and redo it with what appeared to her to be no difference but which clearly made a difference to him. He was drawing an arch, a structural arch, with the keystone detailed in a separate drawing at the corner of the page, the dimensions annotated in that small, cramped hand. "What's this one for?" she said. He looked up. "Addition to the north building. I want to put a second room on workshop space. This is the entrance arch." "Why an arch and not a lintel?" He blinked at her, like the question was unexpected. "I know what an arch is," she said, mildly defensive. "I'm asking why you prefer it to a lintel." An arch distributes load through compression. In stone construction, compression is your friend. Stone is strong in compression, weak in tension. A lintel puts the load and tension at its center. For a wide opening, that's a problem. An arch eliminates it. He turned the drawing toward her so she could see it. The steeper the arch, the more the load wants to go outward as well as down. So you need to think about the thrust at the sides. These walls need to be strong enough to resist it, or you add buttresses. She studied the drawing. "And you've calculated this." "I've calculated this." He pulled another piece of paper from beneath the drawing. Numbers, equations, a page of working. "The wall mass is sufficient if I build the foundation course at least 18 inches deep, which the soil here can support." She looked at the calculation page. Thomas had been a businessman, and she'd managed his accounts for 6 years, which meant she was comfortable with numbers in a way that most women of her acquaintance were not. The equations on this page were of a different kind, but the logic was familiar. Reasoning from given values to necessary conclusions, checking each step against the one before. "Can you show me how to read these?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. You want to learn structural calculations. I want to understand what you're building, she said. I find it difficult to help with things I don't understand. You don't need to help with this. I know I don't need to. She met his eyes. I want to. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached across the table for a fresh piece of paper. All right, he said. Start here. What she learned about him came in increments, unevenly distributed, the way water finds its way through stone, not by force, but by persistence, by the slow accumulation of small passages. She learned that the scar on his jaw was not entirely from a climbing accident, or not only from one. There was a story behind it that involved a dispute over a construction contract in his previous life that had turned physical and ugly in ways he was still not entirely willing to describe in full. She learned this in pieces over several evenings, and she did not push for the pieces he wasn't offering. She learned that he'd grown up in Massachusetts, the son of a carpenter who'd taught him to read material the way other men read print, to feel the quality of stone and timber, to know by touch and sound where weakness lived. He'd gone to a technical institute at 17 on a scholarship that had required him to work 3 jobs to supplement. He'd built his reputation in Boston and New York through the 1870s doing exactly the kind of work the drawings on his table suggested. Substantial, considered structurally rigorous work that other architects had dismissed as too spare, too plain, too undecorated for the fashionable market. She learned that the loss he'd mentioned, the woman who died 15 years ago, had not been a simple loss. Her name had been Clara. She had been an apprentice draftsman in his firm, hired at a time when that was nearly unheard of, because she was better than everyone else who'd applied. She had died in the collapse of a building he'd designed. Not his fault, not his error, but the fault of a contractor who'd substituted cheaper materials and a site manager who'd signed off on inspections he hadn't performed. The legal process had taken 2 years and had resulted in findings against the contractor. Silas had been cleared entirely. He'd walked away anyway. She learned this over the course of several weeks, never in one sitting, never as confession. Just pieces he let fall when the evening was quiet and the fire was going and they'd been talking about something adjacent that led to it. She collected the pieces and held them carefully and did not try to assemble them into a narrative he hadn't offered her. But one night she said, "You know you weren't responsible for what happened to Clara." He was quiet for a long time. "I know that legally," he said, "and morally." "The building I designed didn't collapse," he said carefully. "The building they built for my design, with substituted materials and uninspected work, collapsed. Those are different things." He looked at the fire. "Knowing that doesn't fix the fact that she was in it." "No," Evelyn said. "It doesn't. So I came here," he said, "where if I build it, I'm the one who built it. No substitutions, no site managers, no inspectors who aren't inspecting. What stands or falls is mine." She looked at the walls of the room, stone, fitted and mortared, solid against the mountain winter outside. "It's standing," she said. He looked at her. His face in the firelight was tired and weathered and not particularly easy to read, but something in it was different from the way he'd looked at her in that saloon in Coldwater Pass 2 months ago. Less sealed. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She wanted to say something more and didn't, because she could feel the edge of what he'd given her, and she didn't want to push past it. She turned back to her book and let the fire burn and let him have whatever the silence was for him, and that was all right. That was more than all right. Outside, the valley held its cold and its dark and its extraordinary quiet, and the creek ran somewhere in the darkness under its thin margin of ice, and the mountains stood above it all, absolute and unconcerned, the way they had before either of them arrived and would after both of them were gone. Inside, the fire burned down to coals, and neither of them moved to add wood, and the room went gently dark and warm, and they sat in it, 2 people who had both given up things they couldn't recover and hadn't yet figured out what came next, not saying anything, not needing to. It was not a comfortable silence, exactly, but it was an honest one. And between the 2 of them, honesty had been worth more than comfort from the start. Spring came to the valley the way it came to protected places, earlier and more gently than the world outside deserved. By mid-March, the creek had opened fully, and the sound of it filled the valley from first light to last, a constant low conversation that Evelyn had come to rely on the way she'd once relied on the sound of Chicago traffic outside a window. Not pleasant exactly, but present. a sign that the world was continuing to turn. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving long, dark streaks of wet earth and matted grass. And within a week of that, the first green appeared, tentative and pale, along the creek banks where the water kept the soil from refreezing overnight. She had been in the valley for nearly 4 months. The woman who'd stepped off the train in Coldwater Pass in December, the one with 37 cents and city boots and the braced chest, she was still there somewhere, but she'd been modified by the winter in ways she was only beginning to take account of. Her hands were different. The soft palms that had spent 6 years managing a Chicago household had developed calluses in specific places. The web of her thumb from splitting kindling. The inside of her first 2 fingers from the draw knife Silas had shown her to use on timber. She could read the sky the way he'd taught her, not as well as him, nowhere near as well, but well enough to know the difference between high clouds that meant nothing and low clouds moving fast from the northwest that meant something urgent. She could navigate the lower portion of the trail by memory in reasonable weather. She could field dress a rabbit, though she still didn't enjoy it. And she'd told him so, and he'd said that not enjoying it was fine, that the problem would be if she stopped noticing it. She thought about that sometimes. The problem would be if she stopped noticing it. They had settled into a life that was not the life either of them had imagined, and which neither of them had fully named yet. They were technically husband and wife, and they lived in the same house and ate at the same table and spent their evenings in the same room, but the arrangement was something more specific and strange than that. 2 people who had made a practical agreement and who were discovering, with something like caution on both sides, that they had become necessary to each other in ways that went past practical. She organized his records. That had started in February, when she'd been looking through the shelf above the work table for a book, and had discovered that the rolls of drawings were not actually organized at all. They were chronological only by accident, grouped by no principle she could identify. Some completed projects intermixed with partial studies and material calculations and drawings that appeared to be purely speculative, buildings that had never existed anywhere except on paper. She'd spent 3 days creating a system, cataloging each drawing by type and date and status, making a ledger that cross-referenced the drawings with his written notes. And when she presented it to him, she half expected a repeat of the seller argument. Instead, he'd looked at it for a long time and then said, "I've been looking for a drawing of a pier foundation I did in '78 for 2 years. She found it in 11 minutes. After that, organizing his records became her work, as deliberately as building the stone walls was his. She built indices. She cross-referenced his material calculations with the construction notes he'd kept, and in doing so, she began to understand the scope of what was accumulated in this house. Not just the buildings in the valley, but everything before. A body of work stretching back 15 years that had been bundled up and brought here and buried under 12 years of wilderness living, as if he were trying to forget it was there. She was not going to let him forget it was there. The first trip down to Coldwater Pass in the spring came in early April, when the pass was clear enough to travel, and the supply situation in the valley had reached the point where certain things were necessary rather than merely desirable. Coffee was not the only consideration, though it was high on the list. They went down together, which was different from the journey up. The trail was familiar now, at least to her, and the descent was faster and easier and gave her a different relationship to the landscape than the desperate, cold-focused climb of December. She could look at things now rather than just survive them. She noticed the places where Silas had marked trees or stacked stones in ways she hadn't recognized as marks in December, but now understood. Waypoints, shelter indicators, signs she could read. Coldwater Pass looked the same. It was always going to look the same. The mud on the main street, the glass windows of Pruitt's bank, the saloon with its creaking sign, the general store. What was different was the way people looked at her. In December, they'd looked at her with pity and curiosity, the look reserved for someone in a bad situation making a worse decision. Now they looked at her with something she had to decode before she recognized it, because she wasn't used to seeing it directed at herself. Reassessment. She had come back. She was alive and clearly healthy, and not the picture of someone rescued from a catastrophe. She was standing next to Silas Boon on the main street of Coldwater Pass, buying coffee and salt pork and a particular kind of oilcloth she needed for the record keeping, and she was not diminished. At the general store, the owner, A man named Galt, wide and deliberate, who had served Silas in December with that exaggerated neutrality, came around the counter in a way he clearly hadn't planned and said, "Mrs. Boon, didn't expect to see you back." "Mr. Galt," she said, "I'll need 20 pounds of coffee. And do you carry India ink?" He carried India ink. He also, she noticed, spoke to Silas with a degree more directness than he had in December. Nothing dramatic, just a slight adjustment, the way people adjust when their assessments have been forced to update. It was Pruitt who gave her the most interesting moment. She stopped in at the bank, not because she had any business there, but because she wanted to close whatever remained of that chapter. The lien, the estate, the whole collapsed architecture of Thomas's debts. Pruitt looked at her across his desk with the expression of a man recalculating something. "The lien is settled," he said. "As I wrote in October, the bank took the parcel. There's nothing remaining of the estate." "I know," she said. "I came to tell you there's nothing I need from you." He blinked. "I also want you to know," she said, folding her gloves in her lap with the particular composure she'd been practicing since Chicago, "that whatever you thought you were doing for me when you conveyed Mr. Boon's offer, however much pity was involved in that, you were wrong about the shape of it." She met his eyes. "Good day, Mr. Pruitt." She walked out feeling the specific satisfaction of a sentence delivered precisely. Silas was waiting with the loaded horse outside. He glanced at her expression. "Pruitt?" he said. "Pruitt," she confirmed. They started back up the mountain. None. She found the trunk in June. It was in the back corner of the cellar, behind the preserved goods, under a canvas that had been there long enough that it had acquired its own layer of dust. She almost didn't investigate it. She'd learned to ask before moving things, and she might have simply noted it and moved on, except that the canvas had slipped, and she could see the edge of what was underneath, which was not a storage crate but a flat-top trunk with brass hardware, the kind of trunk that held things of a different category than provisions. She left it alone and mentioned it that evening. "There's a trunk in the cellar, under the canvas in the back corner." Silas was at the work table doing the calculations for the addition to the north building that he'd been planning since February. He didn't look up immediately. "I know. I didn't open it. I know." He set down the pencil. "It's been there since I came. What's in it?" A pause. Not the long kind. Not the kind she'd learned meant he was deciding whether to answer at all, but the shorter kind that meant he was deciding how. "Everything from before," he said. "The things I brought when I came here. I haven't opened it in 12 years. She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because I didn't want to." He picked up the pencil again. "And because everything in it is from a life I don't live anymore, and for a long time looking at it felt like something I didn't want to do." She sat down across from him. "And now?" He didn't answer immediately. He drew a line, measured it, drew another. "Now I don't know," he said. "That's an honest answer." She thought about that for a while. "You don't have to open it," she said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not going to pretend I don't know it's there." He glanced up at her, and something in his face shifted in the way she'd come to recognize. Not softening exactly, nothing that comfortable, but a kind of opening, like a door not swung wide but moved off its latch. "It's got drawings in it," he said, "from the early work, the Boston projects, and there are some things of Clara's, a few drawings she did, a book she gave me." Evelyn was quiet. "I brought them because I couldn't leave them," he said, "and I put them down here because I couldn't look at them." He set the pencil down again and looked at his hands, those large, worn hands that could calculate load distributions and fit stone and make a pair of boots. "I don't know what that means about me." "It means you were grieving," she said. "It means you were a person who lost something and didn't know what to do with the evidence of it." She paused. "That's not a flaw. That's just a person." He looked at her for a long moment. "You could open it," she said. "If you wanted, I'd be there. Or I wouldn't, if you'd rather." "I'll think about it," he said. He thought about it for 2 weeks. And then on a Sunday afternoon in late June, when the valley was at the height of its improbable summer, green and warm, the creek running clear and fast, the mountains luminous above them, he came to find her where she was working on the records at the table and said, "You want to help me with the trunk?" They carried it up from the cellar together and set it on the floor of the main room, and Silas knelt in front of it and worked the latches, which were stiff with disuse, and resisted him for a moment before giving way. She sat on the floor beside him and watched him open it. The drawings were on top, rolled and tied with cord. Beneath them, a set of technical instruments in a fitted wooden case, compasses and rulers, and a set of calibrated weights. Beneath that, books. And then, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept out the cellar damp, a smaller bundle. He unwrapped it carefully. 3 drawings in Clara's hand. She could tell immediately because the line quality was different from Silas's, looser and more expressive, full of energy. A study of an arch detail with notes in a rapid hand along the margin, a sketch of a building facade, and a third that was not a building drawing at all, but a landscape. The rough shape of mountains above a valley, done from memory or imagination, in pencil, with a freedom that suggested she'd done it for pleasure. Silas held that one for a long time. Evelyn looked at it over his shoulder. The mountains in the drawing were not mountains she recognized, but they were the mountains of someone's imagined place, somewhere large and protected and far from the city. She liked mountains, Silas said. She'd never been to any. She used to say— He stopped. She used to say she wanted to build something someday that fit the landscape the way mountains fit the sky, something that looked like it belonged. He looked at the valley through the window. "That's what this is," Evelyn said. He didn't answer. He folded the drawing carefully and held it in his hand and didn't say anything for a while. And she stayed beside him on the floor and didn't say anything either, and it was all right. Well, the letter came down in July, brought up the mountain by a man named Hector Baines, who served as something between a mail carrier and a courier for the high country properties in the county, making one trip in summer and one in autumn. He was a lean, sun-darkened man who accepted a cup of coffee and delivered 3 pieces of mail, and departed without lingering, which Evelyn appreciated. 2 of the 3 pieces were material: a bill of sale from a tool supplier in Cheyenne and a notice about county road assessments that didn't apply to their property. The third was a letter in a handwriting she didn't recognize. She handed it to Silas and watched his face when he read the address on the envelope. He went very still. "Who is it from?" she said. "A man named Aldous Carey." He turned the envelope in his hands without opening it. We worked together in Boston. He was a young architect when I left. He would have been, 23. He found you. He found the county. Silas set the envelope on the table. I had the county listed for tax purposes on the Technical Institute's alumni records. Never thought to change it. He looked at the envelope. "I haven't spoken to anyone from that life in 11 years. Do you want to read it?" "I don't know yet." He left it on the table and went out to check on the livestock, which was what he did when he needed to think about something without being watched. She looked at the envelope on the table. She did not open it. She went back to her work. He came back in the late afternoon and picked it up and read it standing at the window. She waited. "He's been trying to reach me," Silas said finally, still looking at the letter. "He says he's been making inquiries for 2 years. He says—" He paused. "He says there's a firm in New York that's been looking for my drawings, my early work. Apparently 2 of the buildings from the Boston period have come up for renovation, and the current architects want the originals. He says they're offering to buy copies." He set the letter down. "He also says—" Another pause, longer. "He says there's an institute in Chicago, an architectural institute that's putting together an exhibition of structural work from the 70s. They want to include a section on what he calls the efficiency school. He's written an essay that discusses my work. He wants my permission." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "What's the efficiency school?" she said. "A way of thinking about buildings. Structure first, decoration after. Or no decoration, if the structure itself was sufficient." He didn't move from the window. "It was a minority position when I left. Apparently it's less of one now." She looked at the table full of drawings she'd spent months cataloging. 15 years of work. More than 60 completed designs from the Boston period alone, documented now in the ledger she'd made. "And how do you feel about it?" she said. "All of this." He turned from the window. His face was the way it got when he was sorting through something he hadn't sorted yet. Not troubled exactly, but occupied, looking inward. "I don't know," he said. "For a long time I didn't want any of that to touch me. I came here because I wanted to build things that had nothing to do with any of that world. The clients, the contracts, The people who cared more about the marble on the facade than about whether the roof would hold. He looked around the room, at the stone walls, the fitted windows, the careful structure of the place. I built this. This works. This is what I meant to do. Yes, she said, but. He sat down at the table. But I'm 44 years old, and I've been up here 12 years, and I don't know if burying all of it. He tapped the letter. I don't know if refusing to let anyone know the work exists is principle, or if it's just fear. That was the most honest thing he'd said about himself in 7 months. She heard it carefully. There's a difference, she said, between letting the work be seen and going back to the life you left. He looked at her. You can write to Carrie and say yes, use the drawings in your essay, without going anywhere, without changing anything here. She paused. The work is real. It was real before you came here, and it's been real while you've been here, and refusing to let it exist in the world doesn't protect you from anything. It just means the work disappears when you do. He was very still. You said Clara wanted to build something that fit the landscape the way mountains fit the sky. She kept her voice even. Those buildings, the ones he's talking about, do they fit that? After a long pause, some of them. Then let people see them. He picked up the letter again. He read it a second time, more slowly. He sounds like a good man, he said. Carrie. He always was. Write back to him, she said. That's all. Just write back. He sat with that for a moment. Then he pulled a sheet of paper from the stack on the table and uncapped the ink and sat for a while with the pen in his hand, not yet writing, just sitting with the weight of what he was about to do. She went back to her records. She didn't watch him. The sound of the pen on paper started quietly and then steadied into something that sounded like purpose. The storm that came in August was not a winter storm, but something stranger. A summer thunderstorm of unusual violence that rolled down from the high peaks in the late afternoon, cracking the air open with lightning that struck the ridge above the valley 3 times in quick succession and left the smell of ozone thick in the air. It was over in an hour. The creek ran higher afterward from the sudden melt and rain, brown and fast, carrying small debris along its banks. Silas walked the valley perimeter the next morning to check for damage. To the buildings, to the trail, to the drainage channels he'd built along the north face to direct runoff away from the cellar. She went with him because she'd learned that walking the property after weather was how you understood what the property was doing, and understanding was always preferable to assumption. They were on the north face, examining a drainage channel that had partially filled with gravel in the night, when he stopped and looked up at the mountain above them. She followed his gaze. The ridge was sharp and clear in the morning light, the rock face where the lightning had struck still visibly darker, where the stone had split. Above it, the peaks rose into a sky that was the specific sharp blue that followed a storm. I've been thinking about what you said, he told her, about the work. She waited. About it disappearing if I don't let it exist. He kept looking at the ridge. There's something I haven't told you, about why I really left Boston. She turned to look at him. The inquiry about Clara's death, he said. The legal process. I told you it found against the contractor. That's true. He paused. What I didn't tell you is that there was a second inquiry, a professional review by the Institute. And that one, it was more complicated. He turned to look at her directly. They found that the design was sound and that my professional conduct was beyond reproach. But they also noted, and I agreed with them, that I had approved a material substitution 3 months before the collapse. One substitution. I approved it because the contractor made a sound argument for it, and I was under time pressure, and I didn't investigate the alternative thoroughly enough. She kept her eyes on his face. The substitution wasn't the cause of the collapse, he said. The cause was the uninspected work on the load-bearing elements that came later, after my involvement in the site had ended. My substitution didn't contribute to the collapse according to the engineering analysis. He stopped. But I'd approved a thing I hadn't fully investigated, and she was in the building. And whether or not the law or the Institute held me responsible, I held myself responsible for the lapse, for being not careless enough to matter, legally, but careless enough to know about. The valley was very quiet around them. So you came here, Evelyn said, where if you approved it, it was because you'd fully investigated it. Yes. and where the only person who could be harmed by a failure was you. A long silence. Yes. She turned back to the drainage channel and crouched down and began clearing the gravel with her hands, methodically, placing the stones to the side. After a moment, she heard him crouch down beside her and begin doing the same. They worked in silence for a while. The sun was fully up now and the valley was warming, and somewhere along the creek a bird was doing something complicated and musical in the willows. I think you've punished yourself long enough for a lapse in judgment that had no consequence, she said finally, without stopping her work. That's not... He stopped. You don't know that it had no consequence. The consequence was that I stopped trusting myself. I stopped trusting my own judgment about anything outside of what I could completely control. I know, she said. I can see that. She moved another stone. I'm also telling you that 12 years is long enough. You've been in complete control up here. You've built something extraordinary, and you've proven to yourself everything you needed to prove. And Carrie is writing to you from the world and asking you to let the work matter. She stopped and looked at him. That's not the world punishing you. That's the world saying you were worth something and it noticed. He was looking at her with the expression she'd seen develop over months. Not the sealed, performance-free assessment of the saloon in December, but something newer, something that had grown in the specific way things grew in difficult conditions, slowly and with great intention. You're harder to argue with than most people, he said. I'm aware. You know everything you know, and you're not shy about applying it. That's usually called competent, she said, and went back to clearing the channel. He let out a breath that was close enough to a laugh that she countered it. They cleared the channel. They walked the rest of the perimeter. They came back to the house and she made coffee. And he sat at the table and read Carrie's letter a third time. And when she set the cup beside him, he looked up at her with something in his face that she recognized from the trunk, from the drawings, from the mountain landscape Clara had sketched from imagination. It was the look of a man who had been keeping something locked for a long time and was beginning, slowly, with the particular difficulty of a thing long frozen beginning to move, to let it open. She didn't remark on it. She sat down across from him and picked up her pen and went back to the index, and the fire burned low and the valley held them both in its strange, unlikely warmth. And outside the mountains stood the same as they had always stood, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt the future as something open rather than something sealed, not safe. She wasn't naive enough to call it safe, but open. A door moved off its latch, same as before, just a little more. That was enough. Silas wrote back to Carrie in August, and the letter went down the mountain with Hector Baines on his autumn run, and that was that. Or so it seemed. There was no way to know when a reply might come, or if one would, and life in the valley had its own rhythm that didn't wait on the outside world's correspondence schedule. The North Building addition needed to be completed before the first hard frost. The root cellar needed restocking. The trail needed work in 3 places where the summer rains had cut new channels across it. Evelyn watched him send the letter and then watched him go back to work the same afternoon, and she thought that was probably the healthiest thing he could have done. Not sit with the weight of what he'd decided, but simply put it in motion and then return to the actual work of living. She was learning from him in ways she hadn't anticipated when she'd agreed to this arrangement in that saloon in December. Not just the practical things, the sky reading, the stonework, the way you planned for contingencies you hoped wouldn't arrive. Something less nameable. A relationship to time that was different from anything she'd grown up with. Thomas had lived in quarters, but business quarters, social quarters, the small urgent intervals of a man always managing the next thing. Chicago had been a city of quarters. Even her childhood in Ohio had had the rhythms of seasons imposed on it by the calendar rather than the land itself. Here, the time was different. It was longer. It had more room in it. A problem you couldn't solve today would still be there tomorrow, and you'd know more tomorrow than you did today, and so waiting was not failure, but simply method. She'd found this maddening at first. She was, by nature, a solver. And then she'd found it clarifying. And then sometime in the late summer she'd found it necessary, the way good air was necessary, and she couldn't entirely remember how she'd managed without it. The addition to the North Building went up in September, Silas working from the calculations she now understood well enough to check, both of them hauling stone from the creek bed in the mornings when the air was cold and sharp and carried that particular smell of the mountain preparing itself for winter. She was not as strong as him and never would be, but she'd developed a different kind of physical endurance over the months. The kind that came from sustained moderate effort rather than brute force. The kind that let her keep working after he'd had to stop for something else. "You're faster than you were," he observed one afternoon, watching her fit a stone into the mortar bed she'd prepared. "I've had practice." She pressed the stone down, felt its seat, checked the level. "Hand me the mallet." He handed her the mallet. She tapped the stone down another fraction and checked the level again. Acceptable. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "The spring. If Carrie writes back, if the Institute wants the drawings for this exhibition, I'll need to have proper copies made. The originals are too fragile to send." He picked up a stone and began preparing his own mortar bed. "I don't have the time to do the copying myself, not and finish the edition and handle everything else." She looked at him. "I could do it." "You'd need to learn the technical drawing conventions, the title blocks, the annotation standards." "You could teach me." He fitted his stone and checked the level. "I was going to suggest exactly that," he said, "if you wanted to." She set down the mallet. "Silas." He looked up. "Stop framing things as suggestions when you've already decided they're necessary and you're going to need my help." She kept her voice even. "Just tell me what needs doing." He considered her for a moment. The scar on his jaw caught the afternoon light in a way that made his expression harder to read, but she could see the particular movement around his eyes that she'd come to understand as something close to amusement. "I need you to learn technical drawing so you can copy 63 architectural documents to exhibition standard," he said. "It will take most of the winter." "That's better," she said, and picked up the mallet again. Hachsat. The first snow came in October, earlier than the previous year, and settled into the valley with the quiet permanence of a thing that knew it was staying. By November, the passes were closed again, and the world contracted to its winter dimensions. The house, the outbuildings, the valley floor, the creek. The goats came in during the worst nights. The chickens maintained their improbable survival. Evelyn learned technical drawing at the work table through November and December while the fire burned and the snow mounted outside the north windows. Silas taught the way he'd always taught, by doing, by explaining when she asked, by correcting errors precisely without drama. She learned the conventions of the title block, the standards for line weight and annotation, the way dimensions were indicated and section cuts marked. She learned how to read the drawings well enough to copy them accurately. And in learning to read them, she learned more about how he thought, about load and material, and the way a building's structure could be expressed honestly through its form rather than concealed behind decoration. "This one," she said one evening, holding up a drawing of a building she'd been copying for 3 days. "The library in the Harmon Commission. The way the reading alcoves are positioned under the windows. You made the structural columns into the edges of the alcoves. The column is both structure and architecture." "That's the idea," he said. "I've been copying it for 3 days and I only just saw it." Most people who were in the building never saw it. He took the drawing and looked at it for a moment. That was the point. It doesn't announce itself, it just works. "Clara would have seen it," Evelyn said. She said it carefully, not sure of the territory. He looked at the drawing for another moment. "First day she walked through it," he said. "She came out and told me I'd hidden a joke in the structure, and I told her it wasn't a joke, it was a principle, and she said that's what makes it funny." Evelyn laughed. Silas looked at her, and this time the almost smile went further, reached his eyes, stayed there. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," Evelyn said. "She was," he said. "You would have argued about everything and been impossible to stop." "That sounds right." He set the drawing down. He was quiet for a moment in the way she'd learned to wait through. "I'm glad you're here," he said. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without performance, like he'd been holding it in inventory for a while and had determined it was accurate and now was simply reporting the fact. "I mean that plainly, not as a pleasantry." "I know," she said. "I am too." She went back to her drawing. He went back to his calculations. The fire burned. The snow came down outside and made the valley silent in the particular way it was silent in winter, which was not emptiness, but fullness, a sound turned inward, a world paying attention to itself. Hector Baines came up the mountain in late February, which was unusual enough that Evelyn was already at the window when she heard the mule on the trail. He did not typically make a winter run. He came with a reason, which turned out to be 2 letters and a package wrapped in brown paper that he said had come to the county office addressed to Silas Boon, care of whatever residents might receive mail in this district, and the county clerk had held it through the winter because it was too large for ordinary delivery and had flagged it for the first feasible courier opportunity. The package was from Aldous Carey in Boston. Inside it was a copy of an architectural journal, the Structural Record, dated October 1886, with a paper-wrapped note on top in a hand that moved quickly and with great enthusiasm across the page. Silas read the note standing at the table. She watched his face for the things it did when it was receiving information it hadn't prepared for. He handed her the note without speaking. Carey had written to say that the essay had been published in the journal and had generated what he described with evident restraint as considerable response. 3 letters to the editor in the November issue, a request from the Chicago Institute to confirm the exhibition inclusion, and a separate inquiry, which was apparently why he'd sent the journal and the note together, from a man named Voss in New York, a developer, Carey wrote, who was building a large public library and had read the essay and tracked down one of the Boston buildings and walked through it and wanted to know if Silas Boon was available for commission. Evelyn set the note down and looked at Silas. He had opened the journal to the page Carey had marked and was reading. She could not see his expression from this angle, only the line of his shoulders, which was doing something complicated. She waited. He read it twice. Then he closed the journal and set it on the table and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "I don't want to go to New York," he said. "I know. I left that world for reasons that are still reasons. I know that too." She sat down across from him. "But there's a difference between going back to a life and choosing to engage with something specific on your own terms." He looked up at her. "You could write to Voss," she said. "You could say I work remotely. I don't travel to the site in the initial phases. I send drawings and specifications, and you either have someone you trust to execute them or you find one. You could say I require complete control of the structural design. You could say whatever you need to say that would make it possible to take the commission without becoming someone you don't want to be." He was very still, considering. "And if the conditions aren't met," she said, "you decline. That's also an option. But you don't have to decide whether to take a commission before you even know what the commission is." He looked at the journal on the table. He opened it again, not to the essay, but to the letters section at the back. He read the letters to the editor without speaking, and she could tell from the pace of his reading that he was going through them carefully. One of them, she would read later, was from an engineer at a university in Philadelphia who cited Silas's library project as an early example of what he called structural expressionism, and argued that the approach had been ahead of its time and deserved wider recognition. Another was from a practicing architect in Chicago who had used the efficiency principles in a recent school building and wanted to credit the foundational thinking. Silas set the journal down and was quiet for a long time. The work was worth something, he said. He said it not as a discovery, but as a recalibration. The sound of a person updating a belief they'd held for a long time in the wrong direction. "Yes," Evelyn said simply. "It was." He picked up a piece of paper and a pen. He wrote 2 letters that afternoon, one to Carey, thanking him for the essay and asking him to send the Voss inquiry if he had it in full, and one to the Chicago Institute, giving formal permission to include the drawings in the exhibition and providing a list, from Evelyn's index, of the works available and their current condition. He was methodical and direct in both, not effusive, not apologetic for his long silence. She made copies of both letters for the records. That evening she went to her room and took from the inside pocket of her repaired suitcase, which she'd kept even though it was battered because she couldn't quite bring herself not to, a small piece of paper. It was not Thomas's paper with Harold Pruitt's address. That one had disintegrated through folding months ago. This was a different piece, one she'd written on herself, the week before she left Chicago, when she'd been sitting in the empty apartment sorting through what remained and trying to understand what she was actually doing. She'd written, "Find out if there's anything left worth saving." She looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it back. The second winter passed into the third spring, and the third spring opened the valley the same way the second had, earlier and more gently than the outside world, The creek talking, the pale green coming back to the banks. But it was different this spring because they were different, and because a letter came with Hector Baines in April that made everything shift one more degree. The letter from Voss was 3 pages and specific. A public library, 12,000 square feet, to be built on a lot in Lower Manhattan. Budget substantial. Timeline flexible. Voss was, by the tone of his letter, a man who understood that good buildings took the time they took and was sufficiently rare in this belief to say so in writing. He wanted to know if Silas was interested, and if so, what his conditions were. They read it together at the table, which was something they'd come to without discussing it. The habit of reading important correspondence in the same room at the same time, so that the responding didn't have to be explained or summarized, so that they were starting from the same information. Silas set it down when he'd finished and looked out the window at the valley for a while. 12,000 square feet, he said. Significant. It's a real building, not a vanity project. He picked up the letter again and read a passage she couldn't see from her angle. He says he wants something that will still be standing in 100 years, and that doesn't look like it's trying to impress anyone. Those are his exact words. He sounds like someone who's met you before, she said. Something like a laugh. He sounds like someone who read the essay. What are you thinking? He set the letter down. He turned his cup in his hands the way he did when he was working something out. I'm thinking it's been 11 years since I worked on anything that wasn't this valley. I'm thinking that's a long time and my skills are what they are, but the world of construction has moved and I don't entirely know what it's moved to. He paused. I'm thinking you'd need to manage the correspondence because there's going to be a lot of it, and I'm going to be useless at writing diplomatic letters to a developer's representatives. She looked at him. Is that a request? It's an acknowledgement of a limitation. So yes. Yes, he said. He looked at her steadily. I can't do this the way I need to do it without you handling the parts I'm not good at. I knew that when I thought about writing back to Carrie last year, and I know it now. He paused. I want to be clear that I know what I'm asking. I'm asking you to take on actual work, not just helping, work. She thought about this for a moment. Not the decision itself. The decision was obvious, but the fact of being asked clearly and directly without it being dressed up as something else. I'll need to be listed somewhere in the correspondence as managing the project records and documentation, she said. Not because I need the credit, but because it will be confusing if letters are going back and forth with no indication of who's receiving and filing them on our end. He nodded. Agreed. And I want to understand the structural design as it develops. Not to second guess it. I'm not an architect and I know that, but because I can't manage the documentation of something I don't understand. I was going to teach you anyway, he said. Then we're agreed. They wrote to Voss that afternoon. Silas's letter was clear and spare and exactly like him. His conditions laid out plainly, his timeline stated, his process described without apology. He would not travel to the site in the design phase. He would provide complete structural and schematic drawings to a standard any competent local contractor could execute. He required approval authority over material substitutions. He required access to the inspection reports at each phase. He would correspond with the project manager of Voss's choice and expected complete records to be kept and provided at each stage. At the bottom, in a line that was less a condition than a statement, documentation and project correspondence managed by E. Boon. She saw it when she read the letter over before he sealed it. She looked at him. He looked back at her. She didn't say anything. She handed the letter back and he sealed it and gave it to Hector Baines when he left the next morning, and that was that. There was an evening in late May of that year, the third year, the year the correspondence with Voss began, and the valley started its second generation of changes. When Evelyn sat outside on the flat stone she'd claimed as a kind of seat during warm months, the one that angled to catch the last hour of afternoon sun off the western ridge, and she let herself look at what she was living in. The north building addition was complete, properly roofed and tight, in use as a dedicated workspace where the drawing table had been moved along with her organizing systems. The original main room was easier to live in without the constant overlap of work and living space. The stable was expanded. Along the south wall of the main building, in a space that had been bare earth when she arrived, there was now a garden, kitchen vegetables mostly, not decorative, But she'd allowed herself one long bed of wildflowers along the outer edge that were doing exactly what they wanted and not being organized into anything. The creek ran past 40 feet from where she sat. The mountains rose on all sides. The sky above the valley was the deep blue of late afternoon at altitude, that color that didn't exist at lower elevations, too saturated, too precise. Silas came out and sat beside her on the stone, which he did sometimes in the late afternoon when the day's work was at a pause. They'd been doing this for 2 years, sitting on this particular stone in this particular light, without discussing it or naming it, just both arriving there when the light was right. "Voss's man wrote again," he said. "I saw the letter. The contractor he's chosen seems competent." She paused. "I wrote back this morning. The response is on your table for review." He nodded. He looked at the valley. A pair of hawks were doing something above the southern ridge, riding the thermal that formed there in the late afternoon, circling without apparent effort. "I've been thinking," he said. "You do that constantly. You need to be more specific. I've been thinking about this place." He was quiet for a moment. "When I came here, I was hiding in some ways. I'd tell myself I was building, I was creating, I was working, and all of that was true. But I was also hiding. From the work I'd done before and what happened and what I'd been afraid of since." He looked at the hawks. "I'm not hiding anymore." She looked at him. The light at this hour was particular, long and amber, catching the gray at his temples, the permanent weathering of his face, the scar. "No," she said, "you're not." "That's partly you," he said. "You made it difficult to hide. I don't think you know how much of that was deliberate." "It was entirely deliberate," she said. He turned to look at her with the full weight of that gray gaze that she'd spent 3 years learning to read, and she let herself look back with the same directness, because there was no performance required here. Not anymore. Possibly not ever. "I know," he said. They sat in the amber light for a while longer, the hawks circling overhead, the creek keeping its steady conversation below. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked it seriously, like the question deserved a serious answer, and he wasn't confident about what the answer was. She thought about that honestly. She thought about 37 cents in a banker's office, and a stranger's offer, and the journey up a mountain in December in the wrong shoes. She thought about cellar arguments and February blizzards and a trunk opened on a June afternoon and a woman's mountain landscape drawn from imagination. She thought about the ledger she'd made and the letters filed by date and subject, and the drawing she was almost good at now. "I'm building something," she said. "I think that might be the same thing for people like us." He looked at her for a moment more. Then he reached over and covered her hand with his, not dramatically, not with any kind of announcement, just the way you reached for something you'd decided was yours. And she turned her hand over and held on, and neither of them said anything else. The hawks made one more circuit of the southern ridge, and then banked west toward the peaks, and disappeared into whatever life they had beyond the edges of the valley. The valley kept its silence, which was not empty but full, the same fullness it always had, the same depth that went down and down into whatever the mountain was made of at its core. They stayed on the stone until the light went. The Voss Library took 2 years to build, and Silas never once set foot in New York to see it. He designed it the way he designed everything. At the work table in the north building, by lamplight in the early mornings when the valley was still dark, and the only sounds were the creek and the particular silence of a mountain before dawn. He drew it in stages, the way you learn something by increments, the way a building teaches you its own logic as you work through it. The foundations first, then the load-bearing structure, then the skin of it, and always the logic flowing downward, from what was necessary to what was sufficient to what, finally, was beautiful in the way that only necessary things can be beautiful. Evelyn managed the correspondence. That sentence did not begin to cover what she did, but it was the one she used when Hector Baines asked, or when the occasional letter came, addressed to the project, and she needed to explain to some contractor's representative in New York why the lead architect was unreachable by telegraph, and why all communication went through a woman in Wyoming. She said she managed the correspondence and left it at that, and let people make what they would of it, which was another thing she'd learned from Silas. The particular power of not explaining yourself to people who hadn't earned the explanation. What she actually did was build a system from nothing. Every letter that went out was dated and filed. Every specification was cross-referenced to the drawing it derived from. When the contractor in New York, a man named Fells, competent but sometimes careless about communicating changes, deviated from the drawings without notifying them, it was Evelyn who caught it. Because she had built the documentation tight enough that a substituted beam size showed up as an inconsistency between the specification sheet and Fells's material requisition the same week it happened, not months later when the damage would have been structural. She wrote to Fells directly that time. Not to Voss's representative, not through an intermediary, directly in the crisp, economical language she'd been developing for 2 years, explaining the discrepancy and requesting written confirmation of the correction before any further framing proceeded. Fells wrote back somewhat huffily that the substitution was standard practice. She wrote back that standard practice was not their practice, and enclosed the relevant clause from the original contract that Voss had signed, which she had indexed and could therefore locate in 4 minutes. Fells corrected the beam. Silas, reading the exchange, said, "You enjoy that." "I enjoy things going the way they're supposed to go," she said. "If that requires a firm letter, then the firm letter is enjoyable by extension." He shook his head, but the shake contained a laugh that wasn't quite released. The library opened in the spring of 1889, 4 years after Evelyn had stepped off a train in Coldwater Pass with 37 cents and nowhere particular to go. She read about the opening in a copy of the structural record that Carrie sent up with Hector Baines. Carrie had been to the opening and had written a description in his accompanying letter that was 3 pages long and involved more superlatives than Evelyn had ever seen from a man who worked in engineering. The journal's notice was more measured but said essentially the same thing. It was a serious building, precisely constructed, structurally transparent in ways that were becoming recognized as a distinct approach. And it was, in the opinion of the writer, already among the more significant public buildings completed in the previous decade. Silas read both and was quiet for a while. "It's still standing," he said finally. "Of course it is," she said. "I know." He folded the letter carefully. "I know, it's been a while since I built something I couldn't walk around and check myself." "I have Fells's inspection reports for every phase," she said, "if you want to check it." He looked at her. Then he reached over and took the stack of neatly organized reports from the shelf above her work table and sat down and went through them, one by one, with the same thoroughness he applied to walking his own valley after weather. She let him have the time and the silence and went back to what she was working on. When he finished, he put the reports down and said, "It's standing correctly." "Yes," she said. "It is." "What?" Carrie came to the valley in the summer of 1889. He'd been asking to come for 2 years, and Silas had been declining without quite refusing. Always another season, always a reason to wait. Until Evelyn said with the directness she'd stopped apologizing for, "You're going to have to let him come. He's not going to stop asking, and you owe him the visit." "I don't owe anyone visits." "You owe him the courtesy of showing him the work that started this whole thing," she said. "He spent 3 years advocating for you without ever having seen what you actually built. That's a debt of a different kind, and you know it." Silas knew it. He wrote to Carrie. Aldous Carey arrived in late July, having made the trip from Boston to Cheyenne by rail, and then hired a horse in Coldwater Pass with what he later described as the most alarming ride of his life up a mountain trail. He was 36, lean and quick in his movements, with an enthusiasm that manifested as a kind of constant forward momentum, like he was always arriving somewhere. He shook Evelyn's hand and said, "Mrs. Boon, I've read every letter you've written on Silas's behalf, and you are exactly as formidable as the letter suggested." And she liked him immediately. He shook Silas's hand and didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at him with the expression of someone seeing a thing they'd spent a long time imagining and were now recalibrating. "You look like you live on a mountain," Carrie said finally. "I do live on a mountain," Silas said. "Yes, I can see that now." Carrie looked past him at the stone house, at the valley, at the peaks above. "Silas." He stopped. I want to be careful not to sound like I'm reciting from the essay, but this is extraordinary." "Come in," Silas said. Evelyn made coffee. It was 3 days of something Evelyn had not known she missed until it was there. The particular energy of a third person in a space, the way a conversation shifted when it had 3 points instead of 2, the way ideas bounce differently. Carrie was smart in a way she recognized and appreciated. He asked questions to understand rather than to demonstrate that he was asking, and when he disagreed, he said so plainly rather than performing politeness around a contrary opinion. He walked every building in the valley and asked Silas to explain every structural decision, and then asked follow-up questions that were specific enough to show he'd actually processed the answer. On the second evening, sitting outside after dinner with the last of the light going amber on the western ridge, Carrie said, "The Institute in Chicago has asked me again about the exhibition. They've pushed it to next year. They want it to be larger. They're calling it a retrospective of the structural movement, 10 architects, the decade of the 70s to now. They want to give you a full room." Silas looked at him. A full room. 12 to 15 projects. The drawings, the technical documentation, a written statement from you about the approach. They're publishing a catalog. Carrie paused. "I know you've been careful about how much of this you engage with. I'm not asking you to go to Chicago. I'm not asking you to change anything about how you work. I want to know if you'll say yes." Silas turned his cup in his hands. Evelyn recognized the motion and waited. "The documentation is ready," she said, not pushing, just stating a fact. "The index covers everything. We could have the drawings Carrie needs packaged and on their way before first snow." Silas looked at her. "It's your decision," she said. "I'm just noting that the practical obstacle isn't an obstacle." He was quiet for a moment. Then to Carrie, "What's the written statement supposed to be? Your own words about the approach. Why structure first? What you were trying to do and why you thought it mattered. A page, maybe two." Carrie paused. "You could dictate it if you'd rather not write it." "I can write," Silas said, slightly affronted. "I know you can write. I've read your contract clauses." Carrie smiled. "I mean, I'll accept whatever form works for you." "Send me the details of what they want," Silas said. "I'll think about it." Which was, as Evelyn had learned to hear it, yes. Carrie left on the third morning. He shook Evelyn's hand again at the trailhead and said quietly, "He's better than I've ever known him to be. Whatever you've done up here, it's worked." "We've both been working," she said. "That's the whole of it." He nodded like he understood that, which she thought he probably did. She watched him start down the trail and then turned back toward the valley. Silas was standing outside the north building with his coffee and looking at the peaks the way he sometimes looked at them. Not at something specific, just at the fact of them, their size and permanence, the way they organized the sky above the valley into a frame. "He's a good man," Silas said without turning. "He is." She stood beside him. "Are you going to write the statement?" "Already thinking about it." "What are you going to say?" He considered for a moment. "I'm going to say that structure is an argument, Kim," he said. "That every building makes a claim about what matters. What's worth holding up, what's worth the effort of permanence, and that the argument should be honest. That a building that hides what it is, that decorates over its own bones, is making a dishonest argument." He paused. "I'm going to say the frontier taught me the rest of it. That out here, a thing is what it is. A stone is a stone. A joint either holds or it doesn't. There's no room for pretense when the winter's coming and what you built has to stand against it." She was quiet for a moment. "That's good," she said. "Write that." He looked at her. "Will you read it when I'm done?" "You know I will." The statement went to Chicago with the drawings in October, packaged in oilcloth against the weather and carried down by both of them because the package was too large and too important to trust to a single pair of hands on the trail. They went down together, delivered it to Hector Baines's care at the Coldwater Pass post office, and walked the main street one more time in the way they did every season now. Not for long, not with any particular investment in what the town thought, but with the particular ease of people who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone who hadn't been there. Galt at the general store had long since stopped with the exaggerated neutrality. He said good morning and asked about the weather on the upper slopes, and sold them their coffee and did not perform anything. Pruitt had retired the previous year. Some younger man had taken over the bank and knew nothing about them except that they paid their few county obligations on time. The town had changed around them as towns did, slowly and without drama. 2 new streets, a larger school, a hotel, that didn't look like it would fall over in a strong wind. Coldwater Pass was becoming, by frontier standards, a real place. On the way back up, crossing the lower slopes where the aspen had gone gold, and the air was carrying the first reliable cold of the season, Evelyn said, "I've been thinking about something." "About what?" "The valley, the space we have." She picked her way over a route crossing the trail. "The north building. We use it as a workspace, but it's larger than we need for just the two of us and the documentation." He glanced back at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking there are people who could benefit from being somewhere like this for a time," she said. "Architects. Young ones. The kind who can't afford the institute fees, who have the ability but not the access. I'm thinking about what it might mean to have a place where someone like that could come and work alongside someone like you. Not as apprentices, I hate that word, it implies ownership, but as residents," he said. She paused. "Yes, exactly." He was quiet for a stretch of trail. She let him think. "One at a time," he said. "Maybe 2 in summer. I'm not running a school." "No schools, no programs, just people who need the space and the time and the knowledge, coming here, working, leaving better than they arrived. And you'd manage the selection." "I'd manage everything that needed managing," she said. "You'd do what you do. I'd make sure the structure around it worked." He stopped on the trail and turned around to look at her. His face in the autumn light was the same face it had always been, worn and scarred and weathered and not easy to read quickly, but she had been reading it for 4 years now, and she could see in it the thing she'd come to know as his version of moved. Not soft, not sentimental, just deeply attentive, like he was seeing something clearly and wanted to see it properly. "You arrived here with a suitcase and 37 cents, he said. "I know, I was there. And now you want to build a thing." "I want us to build a thing," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the trail and said, "Write up what you're thinking, the structure of it, the conditions. When you've got it on paper, I'll read it and we'll talk." "I already have it on paper," she said. "It's on your table." He stopped again, looked back at her. She kept walking, passing him on the trail. Behind her, she heard what was unmistakably a laugh, a real one. The kind he was still stingy with, but which had been coming more frequently since Carrie's visit, since the library opening, since the evening on the flat stone in May, when he'd covered her hand with his, and neither of them had needed to say what that meant. A laugh with actual sound in it, surprised out of him by the specific pleasure of being known. She smiled at the trail ahead and kept walking. The first resident came the following spring. She was 24, a woman named Pearl Sato, daughter of a Japanese railroad surveyor and an Ohio schoolteacher, who had taught herself drafting from books borrowed from a Denver library and had sent a letter to the Chicago Institute asking if there were any opportunities for someone who had no money and no credentials and could demonstrate competence if someone would give her 30 minutes and a sheet of paper. The Institute had forwarded the letter to Carrie, who had sent it to Evelyn, because Carrie had by this point an accurate sense of what Evelyn Boon would think of a woman who had taught herself drafting from library books. Evelyn had thought exactly what Carrie expected her to think. Pearl arrived in May on the same kind of day Evelyn had arrived in December, desperate and determined and wearing entirely inappropriate shoes, except that it was warm and the valley was green and there was no blizzard to navigate. So the inappropriateness of the shoes was merely inconvenient rather than dangerous. She stood in the valley and looked at the stone buildings and the creek and the mountains with an expression that Evelyn recognized from her own first view of the place. The expression of someone encountering something their imagination hadn't prepared them for. "It's real," Pearl said. "It is," Evelyn said. "Come in. We have coffee." Silas shook Pearl's hand and studied her with the same assessing look he'd used on Evelyn in the saloon in Coldwater Pass, and Pearl, to her credit, met it directly and did not flinch. "Can you read a structural drawing?" he said. "Yes," Pearl said. "Not as fast as I'd like." "Can you calculate a load distribution?" "I can follow the method. I'm slow at it." "What do you understand least?" Pearl thought for a moment. "Material behavior under sustained load," she said. "Creep. I understand the concept, but I can't feel it yet in the calculations. It doesn't feel real to me." Silas looked at her a moment longer. "We'll start there," he said, and went back into the north building. Evelyn looked at Pearl, who looked back at her. That's the equivalent of a warm welcome, Evelyn said. I've been here 4 years, and I can tell you with authority. Pearl let out a breath that was partly a laugh. Understood, she said. Pearl stayed 3 months. She was not an easy presence. She had strong opinions and was not shy about them, and she and Silas disagreed about structural calculation approaches with a regularity and vigor that Evelyn initially worried about and then stopped worrying about when she understood that they were both enjoying it. Pearl left in August with her drawing skills transformed and a letter of introduction from Silas to a firm in San Francisco that he'd corresponded with briefly through Carey's network, a firm that was doing interesting work in structural design and that Silas thought would know what to do with someone like Pearl if given proper guidance about what they were receiving. She wrote to them the following year. The firm had hired her. She was the only woman draftsman in the office. She was, she wrote, making them uncomfortable in ways she found encouraging. Evelyn read the letter aloud at dinner, and Silas said, "Good," and that was the extent of the celebration, which was all it needed to be. Kate, the second resident, came the autumn after Pearl, and the third the following spring, and within 3 years there was a rhythm to it that Evelyn had organized with the same care she'd organized everything. The space prepared, the work materials ready, the correspondence managed so that whoever arrived knew what to expect and what was expected of them. She didn't advertise. She didn't establish anything with an official name or a formal structure. She wrote letters, and Carey helped, and the network of people who knew about the valley grew slowly by word of mouth among the people who needed to know and stayed unknown to those who didn't. There were years when no one came. There were winters when the valley was entirely theirs again, and she found she needed that as much as anything. The specific solitude of two people who had chosen each other thoroughly, who had no performance to maintain because there was no audience. Silas built. He designed a school building in Colorado through the Post, a commission that came through Voss's recommendation, and which he took because the conditions were met without negotiation. The client simply agreed to everything up front, which Silas found either very encouraging or slightly suspicious. The school went up in 1891 and stood correctly, and the principal wrote him a letter saying the children liked it because it had very good light and the classrooms did not feel like closets, which Silas said was a better review than anything the structural record had managed. He built a second addition to the Valley compound, a small reading room attached to the north building, properly windowed, with a continuous bench along 3 walls and shelves above it for the books that had outgrown the original shelf in the main room. The books had outgrown the shelf because Evelyn kept acquiring them, a habit she'd made no effort to curb. The reading room was her favorite room in the valley, and she suspected he knew that, because the windows were positioned to catch morning light from the east, and the bench was at exactly the right height for sitting with your feet up, and a book, and a cup of coffee. She never asked if he'd calculated the bench height with her in mind. She didn't need to. In the winter of 1892, 7 years after Evelyn had arrived, a journalist from a Denver newspaper came to Coldwater Pass following a rumor. The rumor had been circulating in Colorado and Wyoming for several years by then, the way rumors circulate in sparse country where people have long memories and not much else to fill the empty spaces of winter conversation. That somewhere up in the high mountains above Coldwater Pass, there was a place. Nobody could say exactly what kind of place. Some people said a grand house, the kind you wouldn't expect in wilderness. Some people said a settlement, though that seemed unlikely given that no settlers were ever confirmed. Some people said a man who lived like a hermit but somehow kept receiving mail. The rumor had the quality of things people weren't sure they believed, but kept repeating anyway, because the possibility of something strange and extraordinary existing beyond the visible edge of the world was more interesting than its absence. The journalist's name was Crane. He was young and ambitious, and he'd heard the rumor from 3 different sources and had decided it was worth the trip to Coldwater Pass to investigate. In Coldwater Pass, he asked around. He talked to Galt at the general store, who was not unhelpful but was also not forthcoming. He talked to the man who'd taken over Pruitt's bank, who knew nothing. He found Hector Baines and bought him a drink and asked about the high country properties. And Hector, who had been carrying mail to the valley for 7 years and had formed his own opinions about discretion, said that he delivered mail to various properties and didn't discuss his routes. Crane wrote down in his notebook, "No confirmed location." Then he wrote, "But it exists." Because the quality of the not confirming told him something, the particular careful way everyone not confirmed it. He published a piece in the Denver paper that was speculative and atmospheric, a story about frontier legends and the persistence of rumor and what it said about human nature, that people wanted there to be a hidden paradise in the mountains, a place beyond the reach of the ordinary. He was careful and honest. He had not found the location. He was not sure anyone had. But the rumor was real, and that was itself a kind of fact. Silas read the piece when it reached them, 3 months after publication. He read it twice and then handed it to Evelyn and said nothing. She read it. She thought about what Crane had written about why people wanted to believe in such a place. Because the world was hard and narrow, and most people's lives were hard and narrow with it. And the idea that somewhere beyond the next ridge there was a place where things were different, where people had made something extraordinary from nothing, was a necessary idea, was the kind of idea that helped people survive the ordinary with more grace. "He's not wrong," she said. "No." Silas took the paper back and looked at it once more. "He's not wrong. Does it bother you? The rumor?" He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about things he actually intended to answer. "No," he said. "As long as no one knows where it is, the rumor doesn't hurt anything. And if they do find it someday..." He set the paper down. "We built it well enough to show." She looked at him. "That's the most relaxed I've ever heard you be about the outside world." 7 years, he said simply. She understood that. 7 years had changed the relationship to the outside world in the same way time changes all relationships to difficult things, not eliminating the difficulty, but putting it in proper proportion to everything else, so that it was a part of the picture rather than the frame around it. The thing that happened to them was not a story with a clean arc, and she knew that, and she thought that was probably what made it true. It wasn't that they arrived in the valley broken and left it whole. It wasn't that love came in like weather and solved everything. It was more like, and she thought about this with some frequency in the years that followed, the way you think about things you've actually lived. It was more like two people who had both stopped trusting themselves for different reasons, found themselves in a place where trust was the only available tool, and had to pick it up and learn to use it again. She had stopped trusting herself to choose. Thomas's death had done that, had made her wonder whether the life she'd built had been a series of arrangements rather than a series of choices, whether she'd been inhabiting other people's structures her whole life without building anything of her own. She'd been afraid that without the external framework telling her what to do next, she didn't know what she actually wanted. What she'd learned in the valley was that she knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted to build systems. She wanted to impose order on chaos, not because chaos frightened her, but because order was genuinely beautiful to her, the way structure was beautiful to Silas, inherently, for its own sake. She wanted to find things that were worth preserving and preserve them. She wanted to find people who needed a particular kind of help and give it in a particular kind of way, without making the help feel like charity or condescension, without requiring the help to perform gratitude. She wanted a partner, not a husband in the old sense of the word, but someone who could hold up the other side of a thing while she held up hers. She had found all of that in a stone house in a hidden valley in Wyoming from a man who'd offered marriage through a banker to a woman he'd never met, because he'd heard she was desperate and capable and had decided those qualities were worth trusting. Silas, for his part, had stopped trusting the world to let his work be what it was. The legal inquiry, the professional review, the 2 years of process that had cleared him and changed nothing, they had taught him that the distance between what was true and what was believed about what was true could be enormous and devastating and had nothing to do with justice. So he'd removed himself to a place where the gap didn't exist, where what he built was what he built. What he'd learned, slowly and with resistance, was that hiding the work didn't protect the work. It just made the work disappear. And that the fear underneath the hiding, the fear that if he let the world see the work, it would find a way to damage it, to take it apart, to hold it responsible for something it hadn't done, was a fear that had done more damage to him than any inquiry ever had. The work was real. It had always been real. Letting people see real things was not the same as handing them a weapon. She had helped him learn that. He would say so plainly in later years, when people asked about the valley or the work or how the life had come to be what it was. He'd say, "She made it difficult to hide." He didn't mean it as a complaint. There was a morning in the late spring of 1893, 8 years after the train had pulled into Coldwater Pass, when Evelyn woke before Silas for once and lay in the room that had become, without ceremony, their room, listening to the creek and the birds and the mountain making the small sounds mountains make when the season changes and the snow loosens and the water finds new paths to the valley floor. She thought about the woman who'd stood in the pass that first December and looked down at the impossible valley and the stone house she hadn't expected. She thought about what she'd felt in that moment. Not hope, exactly, because hope was too optimistic a word for where she'd been. More like an aperture, a small opening. A door moved off its latch. Every good thing she had, she'd walk through that door to find. Silas woke and lay beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was entirely normal and entirely sufficient. "Pearl wrote again," she said finally. "What does she say?" "She's been offered a partnership position in the firm." She turned to look at him. "Junior partnership. She'd be the first woman partner in any architecture firm in San Francisco." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said, and meant it with the fullness she'd learned to hear in that single word. "She says she wants to come back this summer. Not as a resident, just to show us the drawings she's working on." "Tell her to come in July," he said. "Weather's better." She was already drafting the letter in her mind. The specific phrasing she'd use, the tone that was warm without being effusive, the information that needed to be included about the trail and what to bring and what not to bring. City shoes, Pearl, not city shoes. She was already organizing it because that was what her mind did, and she'd stopped thinking of it as a limitation or an excess of practicality and started thinking of it as the thing she was. The way Silas was the thing he was when he stood at the work table and saw a building emerging from calculation. The mountains were outside the window and the creek was running and the valley was warming into another spring that had no reason to exist at this altitude and existed anyway. Because certain protected things were granted that a season slightly more generous than what surrounded them, a warmth that came from being held on all sides by something enormous and enduring. They were not a legend. They were not a paradise. They were two imperfect people who had made an imperfect agreement in desperate circumstances and had chosen, day after day, with imperfect consistency and occasional arguments about grain storage and structural calculations and how to word a letter to a difficult contractor, to keep choosing it. That was the whole truth of it. The rumor that traveled the frontier in those years, about the hidden valley, the stone house, the man who built kingdoms in the wilderness, the rumor was missing the most important part, the part that couldn't be rumored because it had no visible shape, no architectural feature you could point to and say there, "That's it." The most important part was a woman at a work table with a ledger and a cup of coffee who had arrived with nothing and built the structure that made everything else possible. The most important part was a man with scarred hands and a complicated past who had learned, later in life than he would have wished, that what you build alone is impressive, but what you build with someone who can see what you're actually trying to do, that is the thing that lasts. The valley kept its secret. The mountains didn't speak. The creek ran the same in every season, patient and indifferent and faithful to its own course, the way water always is, the way anything is that has finally found where it belongs. Above the world that had once made its judgments and moved on, two people stayed. They built. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.